January 12, 1888, began with a deceptive, haunting stillness that settled over the Dakota Territory like a frozen shroud. It was the kind of morning where the air feels brittle enough to shatter, and the sun hangs like a pale, heatless coin in a sky of bruised porcelain. At 10:15 a.m., the atmosphere was unervingly clear, but by 10:45 a.m., the northern horizon had vanished behind a wall of charcoal gray, a churning vertical mass of ice and wind that moved with the terrifying speed of a charging cavalry line. The temperature, which had hovered at a relatively mild 20 degrees, began a vertical, lethal descent, dropping 18 degrees in less than 3 minutes as the leading edge of the great blizzard, later known as the schoolhouse blizzard, slammed into the plains with the force of a physical blow. The wind did not merely blow. It erupted with a mechanical, grinding roar that registered 85 miles per hour, carrying ice crystals so pulverized they behaved like liquid, filling the lungs and blinding the eyes of anyone caught in the open. In the burgeoning town of High Crest, the wooden structures built with such optimistic pride during the boom years groaned and buckled. Their thin pine walls offered no more protection than paper against the atmospheric violence. Nails began to pop from the rafters with the rhythmic sound of pistol shots as the timber contracted in the sudden, -40-degree cold. Yet, 2 miles north, nestled into the granite flank of the Great Divide, Thomas Reed sat in a heavy oak chair, watching the flame of a single kerosene lamp. The air in his chamber was motionless, thick with the grounding scent of dry earth and the faint, sweet aroma of cedar kindling. The temperature stood at a defiant, steady 54 degrees. He could hear the storm, but it was a muffled, subterranean vibration. A distant, frustrated animal growling above 10 feet of solid, unyielding stone. Thomas reached out and pressed his palm against the wall, feeling the immense thermal mass of the mountain he had claimed as his own. He had spent 700 days carving this sanctuary out of the living rock, enduring the sneers of neighbors who called his home a tomb for a living man. But as the world outside turned into a white-out death trap, the mountain was finally answering the skeptics with a heavy, protective silence. He checked his watch. It was 11 a.m., and the world he knew was disappearing into the white. The origins of Thomas Reed's obsession could be traced back to the catastrophic winter of 1886, a season the cattlemen called the Great Die-Up, when the plains were littered with the frozen carcasses of 5 million head of livestock that had been unable to find shelter. Thomas had watched the wealthy ranchers lose everything because they trusted the open range and the flimsiness of traditional barns. He decided then that he would never again rely on anything that could be moved by the wind or cracked by the frost. In the spring of 1886, he purchased a vertical acre of granite ridge that no one else wanted and began the grueling task of excavating a home directly into the heart of the mountain. The townspeople of High Crest watched with a mixture of amusement and pity as Thomas arrived at the local mercantile every Saturday to buy blasting powder, steel drill bits, and heavy-duty shovels, refusing to purchase the lumber and glass that defined a civilized residence. Mayor Thorne, a man who prided himself on the town's new 3-story brick hotel, often led the mockery during town council meetings at the saloon, his voice booming over the sound of piano music. "You are building a rat hole, Thomas," the mayor would say, his voice dripping with a condescending warmth as he leaned against the mahogany bar. "A man of your standing should be seen, not buried. Why waste your strength fighting the mountain when you can build a house on top of it in a month?" Thomas would only nod, his hands calloused and stained with stone dust, and reply that he wasn't fighting the mountain, he was enlisting it. The mockery intensified when Thomas began hauling away tons of debris, creating a flat terrace of crushed stone that overlooked the valley. He spent $400 on high-grade explosives and countless hours sharpening his chisels, a process the local blacksmith, Mr. Miller, found both lucrative and absurd. "You're spending a fortune to live like a badger," Miller remarked one afternoon while hammering a dull bit back into shape. "What happens when you realize you can't see the sunset through 6 feet of rock?" Thomas didn't blink as he replied, "I'll know the sun is there because the stone will hold its heat. That's more than I can say for your pine shop." To the people of High Crest, Thomas Reed was a man obsessed with a prehistoric lifestyle, a hermit who had rejected the forward-looking spirit of the 1880s for the dark safety of a cave, and they laughed when he told them that the most advanced technology on the frontier was simply 10,000 tons of rock between a man and the sky. The methodology of Thomas Reed's labor was a masterpiece of patient engineering and brutal repetition. It was a 2-year montage of sweat, dust, and calculated destruction. Each morning began at 5 a.m. with the rhythmic chink-chink-chink of a 4-pound sledgehammer striking a star-point drill, a sound that echoed through the canyon like a steady, mechanical heartbeat. He worked in 3-foot increments, drilling holes deep into the granite face, packing them with exactly 12 ounces of black powder, and then retreating to a safe distance to watch the mountain yield a few more inches of its ancient interior. After each blast, the real work began. The back-breaking removal of the rubble, wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow, totaling an estimated 600 tons of stone by the time the main chamber was finally complete. Thomas was not merely digging a hole. He was designing a sophisticated thermal envelope that utilized the Earth's natural insulation. He carved a vaulted ceiling to allow for better air circulation and chiseled a series of narrow, angled ventilation shafts that used the natural pressure of the mountain to pull fresh air in while keeping the snow out through a system of baffles. He spent 3 months alone on the fireplace, which was not a separate structure but a hearth carved directly into the bedrock, connected to a chimney flue that wound 20 feet through the stone before exiting on a high, wind-swept ledge. He calculated the cost of every foot, noting in his journal that while a wooden house cost $300 in materials and 2 weeks of labor, his mountain home cost him his youth, his social standing, and nearly $2,000 in specialized tools. By the summer of 1887, he had created a living space that remained at 50 degrees regardless of whether the sun was baking the plains at 90 or the frost was setting in. He lined the floors with thick, hand-hewn flagstone and installed a door made of double-thick oak reinforced with iron straps, set 3 feet back into a stone archway to prevent it from being blocked by drifts. He spent weeks polishing the walls until the mica in the granite caught the lantern light, creating a shimmering, subterranean palace that felt as solid as the earth itself. When the blacksmith miller visited to deliver the final hinges, he stood in the cool, silent center of the mountain and shook his head, admitting it was a fine cellar but a lonely place for a man to draw his last breath. Thomas only smiled and told him that he hoped he would never have to prove why the loneliness was worth the price. By late November of 1887, the subtle indicators of a generational shift in the weather began to manifest for those who knew how to read the landscape, though the town of High Crest remained blissfully arrogant in its pursuit of progress. Thomas Reed noticed the behavior of the prairie dogs first. They had stopped emerging from their burrows 2 weeks earlier than usual, and the migratory birds were not merely flying south. They were fleeing in frantic, massive clouds that darkened the afternoon sun for hours. He watched the mercury in his barometer, a delicate instrument he had ordered from Philadelphia, as it began to exhibit jagged, unpredictable swings that suggested a massive low-pressure system was coiling like a spring over the Canadian Rockies. In town, the mood was celebratory, as Mayor Thorne had just authorized the installation of a grand, ornate glass storefront for the new mercantile, and the local schoolhouse had been freshly painted a bright, optimistic red to welcome the new term. The townspeople were obsessed with the modern convenience of their thin-walled structures, boasting about the speed of their construction and the elegance of their shingled roofs that caught the light. Thomas Reed, meanwhile, was methodically stocking his mountain sanctuary with 2 years' worth of cured meats, 500 pounds of grain, and 300 gallons of spring water stored in stone cisterns he had carved into the floor of his pantry. He ignored the snickers of the freight drivers who delivered his final crates of supplies, men who laughed at the sight of a man preparing for a siege when the weather was still mild and the sky was a clear, innocent blue. On January 10th, Thomas observed a rare atmospheric phenomenon. A sundog, a halo of light around the sun that signaled ice crystals in the upper atmosphere, followed by a silence so profound it felt as though the earth itself had held its breath in anticipation. He moved his remaining livestock, 3 sturdy mules and a small herd of goats, into the secondary cavern he had excavated behind the kitchen, sealing the heavy internal gates with iron bolts. He checked the seal on his main door, oiled the heavy iron latches, and waited in the flickering light of his hearth. He knew the arrogance of High Crest would be their undoing. They had built a town for a fair-weather world, but the mountain had taught him that the frontier was an indifferent, predatory force that punished the unprepared with surgical precision. When the blizzard finally struck on that Tuesday morning in January, the transition from normalcy to catastrophe took less than 10 minutes. a violent erasure of the world. In High Crest, the children had just arrived at the schoolhouse, their breath frosting in the air as they hung their wool coats on pegs, when the northern sky turned into a solid, roaring wall of white. The first gust of wind shattered the grand glass storefront of the mercantile, sending shards of expensive plate glass flying like shrapnel through the aisles of dry goods, and within the hour, the town's pride, the 3-story hotel, was shuddering as the wind began to peel the shingles from its roof like scales from a dying fish. The modern buildings were proving to be death traps. The heat from the wood stoves was being sucked out through the thin walls, and the snow was so fine it drifted through the tiniest cracks in the window frames, piling up on the floors of bedrooms. By 2 p.m., the town was in a state of total collapse as the visibility dropped to less than 3 feet. The schoolteacher, a young woman who had only arrived from the east 6 months prior, realized with horror that she could not see the building across the street, let alone lead the children to the safety of their homes. Panic set in as the town's coal supply, stored in an outdoor shed, became unreachable behind a 10-foot drift that had formed in a matter of minutes. Mayor Thorne, huddled in his office as the walls groaned and the floorboards vibrated around him, watched the thermometer on his desk drop to 30 below zero while the wind screamed through the chimney. The chimneys were beginning to fail, blocked by the sheer volume of horizontal snow, and the threat of carbon monoxide poisoning became as lethal as the cold itself. Men who attempted to reach their stables were found days later only yards from their doors, frozen in the act of searching for a fence line they could no longer feel. As the sun set, though no one could see it through the blinding maelstrom, the residents of High Crest realized their terrible error. Their wood was splitting, their fires were dying, and the structures they had called civilized were being dismantled by the wind. In the darkness of the storm's first night, a desperate realization began to spread among the survivors. The only structure in the entire county that wasn't shaking, the only hearth that wasn't being extinguished by the gale, belonged to the man they had spent 2 years mocking. By the 26th hour of the great blizzard, the atmospheric pressure had dropped to a historic low, and the wind had transitioned from a roar to a high-pitched, metallic scream that seemed to vibrate the very roots of the Great Divide. Inside the mountain, Thomas Reed was meticulously recording the time, 12:15 p.m. on January 13th, when he heard the first genuine sign of human desperation, a series of frantic, uneven blows against the iron-strapped oak of his primary entrance. He unbolted the heavy bar, a movement that required his full strength against the vacuum created by the gale, and as the door cracked open, a surge of sub-zero air and pulverized snow erupted into the vestibule like a physical explosion. Collapsing across the threshold was the schoolteacher, her face a mask of white frostbite and her fingers curled like talons around a thick hemp rope. Tied to that rope, shivering in a line of collective terror, were 14 children. The youngest was no more than 6 years old, his eyes wide and vacant from the onset of hypothermia. They had crawled through the whiteout, guided only by the teacher's memory of the ridgeline and the faint, low-frequency hum of the wind over Thomas's ventilation shafts. Thomas pulled them in one by one, his calloused hands moving with a practiced, mechanical urgency as he hauled the human chain into the sanctuary of the stone. The moment the door slammed shut and the iron bar dropped back into its cradle, the silence of the mountain descended like a physical weight, broken only by the ragged, sobbing breaths of the survivors. The temperature inside stood at a defiant 53 degrees, a staggering 90-degree difference from the killing fields only inches away. Thomas didn't offer empty platitudes. He moved with the same methodical routine he had used to carve the room, stripping frozen wool from the children and replacing it with the heavy buffalo robes he had stockpiled for a crisis he knew would eventually arrive. The schoolteacher, her voice a ghost of its former self, looked around the vaulted stone chamber, her eyes lingering on the dry, warm flagstones and the steady, orange glow of the hearth. "We watched the schoolhouse roof peel away like paper," she whispered, her hands trembling as they wrapped around a warm tin of broth Thomas provided. "We thought the world was ending, but here, it's like the storm doesn't even exist." Thomas only nodded, his gaze fixed on the ventilation gauge. "It exists," he replied softly, "but the mountain doesn't care about the wind, and right now neither do we." As the afternoon of the second day bled into a dark, indistinguishable evening, the mountain's door was summoned again and again, each time admitting more of the broken remnants of High Crest. At 4 p.m., a group of 7 freight drivers arrived, having abandoned their wagons and crawled toward the only landmark they could find. The thin, defiant plume of blue smoke rising from Thomas's stone chimney. 2 hours later, a more significant arrival occurred. Mayor Thorne and Mr. Miller the blacksmith appeared, their expensive leather coats frozen solid and their faces unrecognizable from the biting cold. The mayor, the man who had stood in the saloon and mocked Thomas for building a tomb, had to be carried over the threshold, his pride having vanished somewhere between the collapse of his brick hotel and the realization that his fine wool suit offered no more protection than a cobweb. As he was laid near the fire, his breath rattling in his chest and his hands turning a ghostly, waxy white, he looked up at the arched granite ceiling. The sheer mass of the mountain loomed over him with an indifferent grace. "I spent $6,000 on that hotel, Thomas," the mayor wheezed, his voice thick with the early stages of pneumonia. "I thought I had built something that would last a century, but the wind took the 3rd floor in 20 minutes. I'm sorry. I called this a rat hole, but it's the only place left in the world." Thomas continued his work, tending to a small child with a frostbitten ear, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "It isn't an apology I need, Mayor," Thomas said, his voice level and devoid of bitterness. "It's for you to understand that nature doesn't negotiate with architects. You built for the eye, but I built for the earth." By nightfall, the mountain home held 42 souls, a cross-section of a town that had prided itself on its modern progress. The internal atmosphere was a strange, thick blend of claustrophobia and profound relief. The air remained fresh thanks to the angled shafts Thomas had chiseled with such precision, and the scent of the goats in the back chamber provided a primal, agricultural comfort. They were huddled together on the stone floor, the wealthy and the poor alike, bound by the simple, undeniable fact that a man with a chisel and 2 years of patience had been more right than the entire collective wisdom of the Dakota Territory. The logistics of sustaining 42 people and several head of livestock within a subterranean space required a level of discipline that Thomas Reed had spent years perfecting in solitude. He organized the survivors into a functional hierarchy, assigning the strongest men to manage the waste and the women to oversee the rationing of the grain and cured meats he had stored. The goats in the secondary chamber became a vital resource, providing fresh milk for the infants who had been brought in from the cold, while the stone cisterns Thomas had carved into the floor provided a steady, cool supply of water that never tasted of the storm. As the blizzard entered its 3rd day, the sound of the wind outside intensified into a relentless, low-frequency thrum that made the kerosene flames flicker in their glass chimneys despite the lack of a draft. Inside, the temperature remained a constant, miraculous 52 degrees. The thermal mass of the mountain acted as a giant battery that absorbed the heat from the central hearth and radiated it back with steady, unyielding persistence. Mr. Miller, the blacksmith, spent hours examining the ironwork of the hinges and the precision of the stone cuts, his previous skepticism replaced by a professional, quiet awe. He noted in a small ledger that the ventilation system was drawing air with a velocity that suggested the wind outside was exceeding 90 miles per hour. Yet there was no draft on the floor where the children slept. "Thomas," the blacksmith remarked as they sat near the grain stores, "you didn't just dig a hole. You built a machine. You calculated the weight of the air itself, didn't you?" Thomas looked at his calloused palms, the scars of 1,000 drill strikes still visible in the dim light. "I didn't calculate the air, Mr. Miller. I just listened to what the mountain told me about the winter of '86. The people who built High Crest thought they could ignore the history of the land because they had steam engines and brick kilns, but the land has a much longer memory than a railroad company. Throughout the 72-hour ordeal, the mountain sanctuary became a crucible of social reconciliation. The townspeople who had spent years gossiping about the mad hermit now found themselves dependent on his foresight for their very survival. There was no mockery left, only a quiet, heavy gratitude that manifested in the way they moved through the stone halls with a newfound reverence, touching the walls as if they were the skin of a guardian god. On the morning of the 4th day, the screaming of the wind abruptly ceased, replaced by a silence so profound and absolute it felt as though the world had been emptied of sound. Thomas Reed was the first to approach the door, clearing away the 3 feet of snow that had managed to drift into the small vestibule through the intake vents. As he heaved the oak door open, a blinding, diamond-bright glare of sunlight struck the granite, reflecting off a landscape that had been utterly transformed into something alien. The valley where High Crest had stood was now a sea of white waves, with drifts reaching 40 feet in height, burying entire houses up to their gables and leaving only the tops of the tallest trees visible. The survivors emerged from the mountain like ghosts returning to the land of the living, their eyes squinting against the brilliance of the sun on the fresh, lethal snow. The tally of the aftermath began immediately and was devastating. While all 42 people in Thomas's mountain had survived without a single loss of limb or life, the town itself had become a graveyard. 11 people who had stayed in the sturdy brick hotel had perished when the chimneys collapsed and the cold moved in, and the schoolhouse was nothing more than a pile of red timber crushed under the weight of a massive drift. Mayor Thorne stood on the terrace of crushed stone Thomas had built, looking down at the ruins of his ambition with a hollow, haunted expression. He realized that the institutional validation he had sought through construction was a fragile illusion. The only thing that had endured was the structure that had been ridiculed as primitive and backward. As the rescue parties eventually made their way through the drifts from the railhead 20 miles away, they found the survivors of High Crest not in the ruins of the town, but emerging from the side of the mountain, healthy and warm. The institutional response was immediate. The territorial government sent engineers to study Thomas's rat hole, and the story of the rancher's mountain spread across the frontier as a cautionary tale of pride versus preparation. Thomas Reed did not celebrate the validation. He simply returned to his chisel, beginning the work of expanding the ventilation for the next time the sky decided to turn white. He knew the cycle of nature was not a one-time event, but a recurring test of human humility. The legacy of Thomas Reed's 2-year labor did not end with the melting of the Great Blizzard snows. It fundamentally altered the architectural DNA of the Dakota Territory and the character of the people who inhabited it. High Crest was eventually rebuilt, but the new structures were no longer the fragile, thin-walled boxes of the early boom years. Instead, the Reed method became the regional standard, with homes built partially into the hillsides and foundations sunk deep into the bedrock with massive stone hearths serving as the structural anchors. Thomas himself lived another 20 years in his mountain sanctuary, becoming a figure of quiet, mythic importance, a man who was no longer called a hermit, but a sage. After his death in 1908, the mountain home was not abandoned to the dust. It was preserved as a communal refuge and later a historical site, a symbolic artifact of a time when human arrogance was humbled by the indifferent power of the natural world. On the iron-strapped oak door, which still hangs on the same hinges Mr. Miller delivered in 1887, there is a small brass plaque commissioned by the survivors of the blizzard. It doesn't list the cost of the blasting powder or the tons of stone moved. It simply bears a single thematic line that Thomas Reed had written in the final entry of his construction journal. Preparation is the only form of respect the earth truly recognizes even today, when the northern winds begin to howl across the plains and the temperature begins its terrifying descent toward the freezing point. The people of the valley look toward the granite ridge and see the thin, steady plume of smoke rising from the stone chimney. It remains a reminder that the most advanced technology we possess is often the oldest. The willingness to listen to the land, the patience to work with the mountain instead of against it, and the humility to realize that our pride is as fragile as a shingle in a gale. The mountain still stands, silent and heavy, a monument to the man who understood that survival is not a matter of luck, but a matter of how deep you are willing to dig before the storm arrives. The town below may change, and the faces in the mercantile may be different, but the rock remains. A cold, hard truth that kept 42 people alive when the world tried to freeze them solid.